Gustav Larsen stood outside his cabin in the February dawn, watching the narrow ring of green grass that circled his home like an accusation. Every other trapper in the valley called it proof of his foolishness, visible evidence that his roof bled heat into the winter air. But in 72 hours, that green ring would be the only thing keeping him alive. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story might just change how you see the wilderness. The year was 1841. January had arrived in Montana Territory with the kind of cold that made breathing painful and turned moisture in beards to ice within minutes. Gustav Larsen and Thomas Yates had spent the morning checking their trap line along a frozen creek 3 miles from their cabin. They had caught 2 beavers, decent pelts that would bring fair prices at the spring trading post. By midday they were heading back, boots crunching through snow that had fallen steadily for 3 days. Gustav noticed the cabin's profile had changed before they were close enough to see details. The roof line sagged in the middle, a depression that had not been there at dawn. He stopped walking. Thomas turned back with a questioning look. Gustav pointed without speaking. Thomas saw it too. They both understood immediately. The roof was failing under accumulated snow weight. They approached carefully, as if sudden movement might trigger collapse. The cabin was small, 12 feet by 14 feet, built the previous summer using standard frontier construction. Horizontal logs notched at corners, mud and moss chinked between gaps, single door, 1 small rawhide-covered window. The roof was typical for the region, ridge poles spanning the width, split planks laid across covered with birch bark, and topped with 4 inches of sod. It had taken 3 days to build. The snow on the roof was nearly 3 feet deep, wet, heavy snow in layers from the past week. The sod beneath had absorbed moisture and frozen, adding crushing weight. The ridge poles bent visibly under the load. Gustav could see stress cracks in the sod where the roof had shifted beyond structural tolerance. Thomas looked at Gustav, then at the cabin, calculating. They needed the pelts inside. They needed supplies, winter provisions, ammunition, and powder near the fireplace. Everything they owned was in that cabin. Thomas handed his rifle to Gustav and moved toward the door. Gustav started to protest, then stopped. Someone had to go inside. Thomas pulled open the door and stepped in. Gustav heard him moving around, gathering what he could carry. 30 seconds passed. 45. Gustav counted without meaning to, every sense focused on sounds from the cabin. He heard Thomas say something, the words muffled but the tone casual. Then Gustav heard the sound that would change everything he understood about wilderness shelter. It was not dramatic. No thunderous crack, no warning groan, just soft creaking, followed by a rush of settling weight. The roof collapsed inward with a sound like a heavy blanket dropping. The walls shuddered but held. Snow and dust puffed through the door and window, then silence. Gustav dropped both rifles and ran. He reached the doorway and looked inside. The interior was dark, filled with suspended snow and earth particles. The roof had come down as a single mass, ridge poles still connected to sod, everything collapsing together. He could see the edge of Thomas's coat beneath several 100 pounds of frozen earth, wood, and snow. He started digging immediately using his hands, throwing aside sod chunks and splintered planks. He dug for 20 minutes before admitting what he had known from the first moment. Thomas Yates was dead. Gustav buried Thomas Yates 2 days later on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had trapped together. The ground was frozen solid. He spent 6 hours breaking through ice and earth with a pickaxe borrowed from James Pritchard, a trapper who lived 4 miles east. Pritchard helped dig and stayed for the brief ceremony. Gustav marked the grave with stones and a wooden cross hewn from pine. He spoke no words over the grave. There seemed to be nothing adequate to say. He could not return to the collapsed cabin. The structure was uninhabitable, the interior filled with debris, the roof damage too extensive for quick repair. Marcus Webb, another trapper whose cabin sat 5 miles north, offered temporary shelter. Gustav accepted and moved his salvaged supplies to Webb's small structure. He slept on the floor near the fireplace. He did not sleep well. Every night, he lay awake calculating. The roof had been 4 inches of sod over birch bark, over split planks, over ridge poles. Standard construction. The same method used by dozens of trappers across the territory, the same method that had worked adequately for years. But adequate was not the same as safe. Thomas was dead because adequate had failed. During the days while Webb checked his own trap lines, Gustav visited other cabins in the area. He studied their roofs with new attention. He measured snow accumulation with a marked stick. He noted which cabins showed sagging, which showed stress cracks, which appeared stable. A pattern emerged over those first weeks of February. Every cabin in the region used the same basic roof construction, 4 to 6 inches of sod over minimal structural support, and every roof showed dangerous snow accumulation. He asked other trappers about roof failures. The stories came easily. A cabin that had collapsed 3 winters ago, killing a man named Dutch Henry. Another that had failed during a spring thaw, fortunately while unoccupied. A third that had partially collapsed, destroying supplies but sparing the trapper who had been outside at the time. Roof failure was common enough that most mountain men accepted it as an inevitable risk, like bears' attacks or drowning in spring rivers. Gustav could not accept it. His carpenter's training in Sweden had taught him that structures failed for specific preventable reasons. Weight exceeded capacity, materials degraded, connections weakened. Each failure had a cause, and each cause had a solution. He began sketching on pieces of birch bark, drawing roof cross-sections, calculating loads. Wet snow weighed approximately 7 pounds per cubic foot. 3 feet of snow on a 12 by 14-foot roof meant roughly 2,500 pounds of weight. Standard ridge poles and planking could not support that load indefinitely. The mathematics were simple. The solution was not. He needed a roof that could either support extreme weight or prevent extreme accumulation. Other trappers noticed his preoccupation. Webb commented that grief affected men differently. Some drank. Some grew silent. Some became obsessed with details. Gustav did not argue. He continued his calculations through the cold February nights, working by firelight while Webb slept, filling bark sheets with numbers and diagrams that pointed toward a solution he was only beginning to understand. February gave way to March. The snow began to thin as temperatures rose slightly, though winter's grip remained firm across Montana territory. Gustav continued his systematic study of roof construction and failure. He visited abandoned cabins, structures left behind by trappers who had moved on or died. He measured collapsed roof debris, calculated the weight that had caused failure, examined the breakpoints where wood had splintered or connections had torn apart. He discovered that standard 4-inch sod roofs with 2 feet of wet snow reached the failure threshold. Some roofs held, others collapsed, depending on minor variations in construction quality. But all operated near their structural limits. 3 feet of snow exceeded capacity in nearly every case. The storm that had killed Thomas had simply revealed a weakness inherent in standard frontier building methods. Gustav also observed something unexpected. Cabins that maintained warmer interiors showed less snow accumulation on their roofs. The heat escaping through the thin sod created a slight melting effect at the snow-sod interface. This prevented the kind of bonding that added structural stress. But the heat loss was significant. Trappers with warm roofs burned substantially more firewood, maintaining interior temperature. The observation triggered a memory from his youth in Sweden. His father's carpentry workshop had been attached to their home, sharing a common wall. That wall was built thick, nearly 18 inches of stone and earth, creating thermal mass that moderated temperature in both structures. The thick wall absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, creating stability. It did not bleed heat wastefully. It stored heat and managed its release. Gustav began to theorize. What if a roof could be built thick enough to create thermal mass while also being strong enough to support its own weight? The thickness would store interior heat and release it slowly upward, preventing the kind of snow bonding that created dangerous accumulation. But the thickness would add weight, requiring stronger structural support. It seemed contradictory. A heavier roof to solve a weight problem. He visited the trading post in late March, a day's ride from the valley where he trapped. Henry Dalton operated the post, a rough-built structure that served trappers within a 30-mile radius. Gustav asked about roof failures. Dalton had been at the post for 9 years. He remembered at least 15 cabins that had collapsed, most during winter, several with fatal results. The problem was well known. The solution was considered impossible. You could not build a roof strong enough to hold any amount of snow. You could only build quickly, build adequately, and hope. Gustav asked different questions. What materials were available? Could canvas be purchased? What about clay, iron brackets, heavy nails? Dalton had canvas in stock, used mainly for wagon repairs. Clay could be dug locally. Iron hardware was expensive, but available. Dalton asked what Gustav was planning. Gustav did not fully explain. He was not yet certain his theory would work, but he left the trading post with a list of supplies and a forming conviction that the solution required rejecting conventional wisdom about frontier construction. April arrived with melting snow and muddy ground. Gustav remained at Marcus Webb's cabin, helping with spring work in exchange for shelter, but spending every spare moment refining his roof design. He filled more birch bark sheets with calculations, cross-sections, and material lists. The theory that had begun as intuition was becoming concrete engineering. His plans centered on increasing roof thickness from 4 inches to 15 inches. The additional mass would serve multiple functions. First, it would create thermal storage. Heat from the cabin's interior would penetrate the lower layers of sod and earth during the day when the fire burned. At night, that stored heat would release slowly upward, creating a temperature gradient that prevented snow from bonding to the roof surface. Second, the thickness would distribute weight more evenly. Instead of concentrated stress on a few ridge poles, the load would spread across the entire structure. Third, the additional sod would create a living root matrix. Grass roots would interweave through the thick layer, binding it into a flexible but unified mass rather than discrete layers that could separate and slide. The weight calculations were critical. 15 inches of sod, clay, and earth would weigh approximately 4,000 pounds for a 12 by 14-foot roof. That was massive compared to standard construction's 800 pounds. But if properly distributed across reinforced ridge poles and a solid plank deck, the structure could support it. Gustav calculated he would need ridge poles 8 inches in diameter instead of the typical 4 inches, spaced 14 inches apart instead of 24. The plank deck would need to be split lumber, not rough poles, fitted tightly to create a continuous surface. The materials list was extensive and expensive by frontier standards: canvas for moisture barrier, extra clay for binding layers, pine pitch for waterproofing, heavy iron nails for securing planks. The cost would be 3 times a standard roof. The construction time would be 8 to 10 weeks instead of 3 days. Any trapper looking at the plan would consider it wasteful and excessive. Gustav shared his theory with Webb in early April. They sat by the fire after supper, and Gustav explained the thermal mass concept, the weight distribution, the structural reinforcement. Webb listened, then shook his head. He did not mock, but he was skeptical. The idea violated basic frontier principles: build fast, build light, build adequate. A roof that took months to construct and cost a small fortune in materials made no practical sense. If Gustav wanted to waste his time and money, that was his choice. But Webb would not be copying the design. Other trappers heard about the plan through frontier gossip, James Pritchard visited to discuss it. He asked good questions about weight load and thermal dynamics. He seemed intrigued, but ultimately unconvinced. The time investment alone seemed prohibitive. Marcus Webb told others about the Swedish fool building a roof thick as a wall. The nickname stuck. Before Gustav even began construction, his design had become a joke among the scattered trapping community. He did not argue or defend himself. He simply continued his calculations and prepared to prove the theory through practice. Gustav returned to the valley in late April 1841. The site where he and Thomas had built their first cabin was unusable. The collapsed structure, a reminder he had no desire to preserve. He selected a new location half a mile upstream on slightly elevated ground with good drainage and clear sight lines in 3 directions. The spot was less convenient to water, but offered advantages he now valued more than convenience. If snow accumulated and melted rapidly, his cabin would be above potential flooding. If threats approached, human or animal, he would see them coming. He spent the first week clearing the site and cutting logs. Most trappers used whatever trees were accessible, prioritizing speed over selection. Gustav walked through timber stands for 3 days, marking specific trees. He wanted logs of consistent diameter, approximately 10 inches, with minimal taper and straight grain. He rejected crooked logs, logs with excessive knots, logs that showed rot or insect damage. When he finally began cutting, each tree was chosen deliberately. The felling and hauling took 2 weeks. He cut 30 logs for walls, each 12 feet long. He cut additional logs for ridge poles, selecting the straightest specimens he could find, 8 inches in diameter. Other trappers passing through the area stopped to watch. They commented on his selectivity. Why spend days choosing logs when adequate timber stood everywhere? Gustav did not explain. He simply continued working. In mid-May, he rode to the trading post. Henry Dalton raised his eyebrows when Gustav presented his supply list. 40 yards of heavy canvas, 200 square-cut iron nails, 3 iron brackets, a gallon of pine pitch. The total cost was significant, representing a substantial portion of Gustav's earnings from the previous trapping season. Dalton asked again what he was building. Gustav said simply that he was building a cabin that would not collapse. Dalton loaded the supplies and wished him luck. He had the tone of a man who thought luck would not be sufficient. Gustav returned to his site and began foundation work. Most mountain cabins sat directly on ground with logs resting on dirt or, at best, flat stones at corners. Gustav dug a shallow trench around his cabin's perimeter, 8 inches deep. He filled it with stones gathered from the creek bed, creating a level base that would prevent settling. The work took 4 days. It was invisible labor, effort that would show no obvious benefit. But Gustav understood that foundations mattered. Structures failed from the bottom up as often as from the top down. By early June, he was ready to begin wall construction. The foundation was complete, the logs were cut and debarked, the supplies were organized. Marcus Webb visited the site and surveyed the preparation work. He shook his head, but said nothing critical. James Pritchard came by 2 days later and examined the stone foundation with interest. He commented that it was thorough work, perhaps more thorough than necessary, but solid. Other trappers heard about the extended preparation time. The jokes continued. The Swedish fool was building a fortress, not a cabin. He would finish construction just in time for winter, if he finished at all. Gustav began raising walls in early June. The weather was good, clear, and warm, ideal for construction. He worked alone, which slowed progress, but allowed him complete control over every detail. Each log was positioned carefully, the notches cut with precision. The fit between logs tested and adjusted until gaps were minimal. Standard frontier notching was crude but fast, accepting gaps that would be filled with chinking. Gustav's notching took 3 times longer, but created joints so tight that chinking would serve as seal rather than structural necessity. He used techniques learned during his apprenticeship in Sweden. Each notch was cut at a slight angle, creating a wedge that tightened under weight rather than loosening. The bottom of each log was shaped with a draw knife to match the curve of the log beneath it, maximizing contact area. Where most trappers stacked logs and moved on, Gustav spent hours on each layer, checking level, adjusting fit, ensuring that weight would distribute evenly as the walls rose. The corners received special attention. Standard notching created a crosshatch pattern where log ends extended past corners. This was adequate for normal loads but created leverage points where lateral pressure could shift logs. Gustav cut his notches deeper and used iron spikes to pin logs together at corners. He drove 6-inch nails through the overlapping sections, clinching them on the interior side. The result was corners that could not be disassembled without destroying the logs themselves. Marcus Webb visited in late June and watched Gustav work for an hour without speaking. Finally, he commented that the cabin was being built like a fortress. Gustav replied that it was being built to last. Webb asked how long a cabin needed to last. Most trappers moved on after a few years, following game or seeking new territory. Why invest so much effort in a structure that might be abandoned? Gustav said he was not building for resale. He was building to survive. Webb left shaking his head. By mid-July, the walls were complete. They stood 7 feet tall, composed of 12 rounds of logs. The structure was square, solid, unremarkable from outside, except for the exceptionally tight fitting between logs. James Pritchard examined the walls and admitted they were the best constructed cabin walls he had seen in the territory. But he questioned whether the perfection was necessary. Would standard construction not have sufficed? Gustav's answer was simple. Thomas Yates had died in a cabin built with standard construction. The door frame required special consideration. Standard frames were simply openings cut in the wall, with thin logs serving as header and sill. Gustav created a reinforced frame, using doubled logs at the header to support the weight he planned to place above. He mortised the frame logs into the adjacent wall logs, creating interlocking connections. The frame became part of the wall structure rather than a weak point cut into it. Other trappers, hearing about the reinforced door frame, added it to their collection of jokes. Was Gustav expecting to hang a bank vault door? The mockery was good-natured but persistent. No one understood yet why such reinforcement mattered. Late July brought the phase of construction that would make Gustav's design visible to skeptics. Until now, the cabin had been unusual only in its exceptional craftsmanship. The walls were tighter, the corners stronger, the foundation more substantial, but the overall appearance was conventional. The roof framework would change that perception completely. Gustav began by laying ridge poles across the width of the cabin. Standard construction used poles 4 inches in diameter, spaced 24 inches apart. This was adequate for supporting bark and a thin layer of sod. Gustav used logs 8 inches in diameter, carefully selected for straightness, spaced 14 inches apart. The difference was immediately visible. Where a standard roof might use 6 ridge poles, Gustav's design used 12. Where standard poles were branches cleaned of bark, Gustav's were sized logs that required substantial effort to lift into position. He worked for 3 days, positioning and securing the ridge poles. Each was notched to sit firmly on the top wall logs, creating solid bearing points. He used iron brackets at stress points, reinforcing connections that would normally rely on gravity and friction. The framework, even before planking, looked overbuilt by frontier standards. Marcus Webb stopped by during this phase and brought 2 other trappers with him. They stood outside the cabin studying the roof structure. One asked if Gustav was planning to park a wagon on his roof. Webb mentioned that a betting pool had started among local trappers. The wager was not whether the roof would collapse, but when. Most bets centered on the first significant snowfall. Gustav ignored the comments and began laying planks. He had split planks from pine logs during spare hours in June, creating boards approximately 4 inches wide and 1 inch thick. He laid them across the ridge poles perpendicular to the span, fitting them tightly together. Where standard construction used rough poles with gaps between them, Gustav created a continuous deck. The planking alone took a week. He nailed each plank to the ridge poles using the square-cut iron nails he had purchased from the trading post. The nails were expensive, but they created connections that would not loosen over time like wooden pegs. James Pritchard visited during the planking phase and asked detailed questions. He understood structural principles better than most frontier trappers. He acknowledged that Gustav's framework could certainly support significant weight, but he questioned whether such capacity was necessary. The framework alone represented more labor and material than an entire standard cabin. Was Gustav overcompensating for the trauma of Thomas's death? Was this elaborate construction simply grief expressing itself through excessive preparation? Gustav's response was measured. He explained that he was not building excessively, he was building correctly. Standard construction accepted failure as inevitable. A certain percentage of cabins would collapse each winter, a certain number of trappers would die, and this was considered the cost of frontier life. Gustav rejected that acceptance. Failure was not inevitable if structures were engineered properly. The roof framework that seemed excessive was actually precisely calculated to support the load he intended to place on it. Pritchard listened, but remained skeptical. The proof, he said, would come with winter. Early August brought the phase that would define Gustav's innovation. The roof framework was complete, a robust structure of heavy logs and tight planking that could support substantial weight. Now came the layering system that would transform excessive framework into functional engineering. Gustav began on August 3rd, working methodically through a process he had planned during the spring months but never tested at this scale. The first layer was canvas. He unrolled the heavy fabric across the entire plank deck, stretching it tight and nailing it at 18-inch intervals. The canvas created a continuous moisture barrier, protecting the wood structure beneath from water infiltration that caused rot. Most trappers used birch bark for this purpose, accepting gaps and eventual degradation. Canvas was more expensive, but more reliable. Gustav overlapped seams by 6 inches and sealed them with pine pitch heated to liquid consistency. The pitch work was tedious, requiring constant fire maintenance to keep the material workable. He spent 3 days completing the canvas layer, creating a waterproof membrane that would preserve the structural wood indefinitely. The second layer was clay. Gustav had located a clay deposit near the creek and spent a week digging and hauling. He mixed the clay with water to create workable consistency, then added pine needles as binding fiber. The mixture was similar to adobe used in southwestern territories, but adapted for the Montana climate. He spread it across the canvas in a layer 4 inches thick, smoothing it with a flat board to create even coverage and a slight crown for water runoff. The clay served multiple functions. It added thermal mass for heat storage. It created a base for subsequent layers. It sealed any imperfections in the canvas beneath. The clay required a week to dry partially before the next layer could be added. During this waiting period, other trappers visited. Marcus Webb brought 3 men Gustav had not met, trappers from farther north who had heard about the unusual construction. They examined the clay layer and asked questions. One calculated that Gustav had added perhaps 800 pounds of clay to his roof. Combined with a heavy framework, the structure already carried more weight than a standard completed roof. And Gustav was not finished. The visitors left shaking their heads, the betting pool odds shifting toward earlier collapse predictions. The third layer was mixed earth and organic matter. Gustav dug soil from the meadow, mixing it with partially decomposed leaves, pine duff, and small roots. This layer was 6 inches thick, creating additional thermal mass and a growing medium for the final layer. He spread it carefully, maintaining the slight crown shape established by the clay. The mixed earth was heavy, requiring multiple trips with buckets. James Pritchard helped for 2 days, curious about the process despite his skepticism. He commented that the work was like building a garden on a roof. Gustav agreed. That was essentially correct. The fourth and final layer was living sod. Gustav cut squares of meadow grass, roots intact, and laid them, like tiles across the earth layer. The roots would grow downward into the mixed earth, creating a living matrix that would bind the entire roof into a unified mass. The grass on top would continue growing, requiring occasional trimming, but providing a living, flexible surface that would move with seasonal changes without cracking or separating. Gustav completed the roof on August 27, 1841. The total thickness from canvas to grass surface was 15 inches. The weight was approximately 4,000 pounds, distributed across the reinforced framework. From outside, the cabin looked unusual, but not absurd. The thick roof created a distinctive profile, heavier than standard construction. But the proportions were reasonable. The real test would come with use and weather. He spent September completing interior work. He built a stone fireplace in the northeast corner, gathering flat stones from the creek and using clay mortar. The fireplace design included a smoke shelf and a narrow chimney, features uncommon in frontier cabins, but standard in European construction. The smoke shelf prevented downdrafts and reflected heat into the room. The narrow chimney created better draw and prevented animals from entering from above. He constructed a sleeping platform along one wall, raised 2 feet off the dirt floor for warmth and storage. He built shelves and a simple table, each piece fitted carefully and secured solidly. By late September, the cabin was habitable. Gustav moved his supplies from Marcus Webb's cabin and established residence. He split firewood and stacked it inside, preparing for winter. He organized his trapping equipment and food stores. The interior was warm, dry, and solid. The thick roof created excellent insulation. Even with a small fire, the cabin maintained comfortable temperature. The first significant event occurred in mid-October. An early snowfall dropped 6 inches of wet snow across the region. Gustav woke the morning after the storm and went outside to assess his roof. The snow had fallen evenly, covering the grass surface. But around the perimeter of the cabin, a narrow band of ground showed no snow. The perimeter was approximately 18 inches wide, circling the entire structure. The ground in this band was bare, slightly damp, as if the snow had fallen and immediately melted. Marcus Webb visited 2 days later and immediately noticed the snow-free perimeter. He walked around the cabin examining it, then laughed. He called it proof that Gustav's roof bled heat. The thick layers were not insulating efficiently. Heat was escaping through the roof and melting snow on the ground around the cabin's base. Webb calculated that Gustav would burn twice the firewood maintaining interior warmth because his roof was radiating heat wastefully. Other trappers heard about the green ring. Several visited to see it themselves. James Pritchard came and studied the phenomenon carefully. He asked how much firewood. Gustav was burning. Gustav reported that his consumption was normal, perhaps even slightly less than expected, because the thick roof insulated so well. But the visible evidence seemed to contradict this. The melted perimeter suggested significant heat loss. The nickname evolved. Gustav had been the Swedish fool for his construction methods. Now he became Larson with the heat bleed, or simply the man heating the ground. The mockery was not malicious, but it was persistent. Every trapper who saw the green ring interpreted it as proof of poor design. Gustav did not argue. He understood what they did not. The thermal bleeding was intentional. Winter arrived in full force in late November 1841. The first major storm dropped 18 inches of snow over 2 days. Temperatures fell to 10 degrees below zero. Across the region, trappers settled into their cabins, burning firewood, checking traps when weather permitted, enduring the long, dark months until spring. Gustav watched his roof's performance with the attention of an engineer testing a hypothesis. After the 18-inch snowfall, his roof showed minimal accumulation. The snow had fallen evenly across the grass surface, but within 12 hours it had compressed and partially melted at the interface between snow and sod. The thick roof's stored heat created a temperature gradient. The bottom of the snow layer was slightly above freezing, while the top remained well below. This prevented the bonding that occurred on cold roofs where snow froze solid to the surface. When wind blew across Gustav's roof, the unbonded snow moved slightly, preventing dangerous accumulation. The green ring around the cabin's perimeter became more pronounced with each snowfall. After every storm, the 18-inch band of bare ground reappeared within hours. To observers, this remained evidence of wasted heat. Marcus Webb visited after the first major storm and pointed out that standard cabins showed 2 to 3 feet of snow on their roofs, while Gustav's showed perhaps 8 inches. Webb interpreted this as proof that Gustav was melting snow through excessive heat loss rather than through good design. Gustav invited Webb inside to demonstrate actual firewood consumption. He showed his woodpile, marked to track usage. The numbers were clear. Gustav burned approximately the same amount of firewood as other trappers, perhaps 10% less, because his insulation was superior. The heat creating the green ring was not wasted heat. It was controlled thermal bleeding, a small percentage of total heat output that prevented dangerous snow accumulation. The investment of heat was minimal. The return in safety was substantial. Webb remained unconvinced. The mathematics were difficult to argue with, but the visible evidence seemed obvious. A roof that melted snow around the cabin's base was losing heat. The fact that interior temperature remained stable suggested Gustav simply burned more firewood than he admitted. Webb left still skeptical, and his skepticism reflected the general opinion among area trappers. December and January brought additional storms. Each time, Gustav's roof shed load naturally through the thermal gradient effect. He never climbed on his roof to shovel snow. Other trappers spent hours clearing accumulation from their roofs, dangerous work that occasionally resulted in falls or injuries. James Pritchard visited in late January and acknowledged that Gustav's roof required less maintenance. But he attributed this to luck or to the specific angle of the roof rather than to intentional design. The winter of 1841-42 was moderate by Montana standards. Total snowfall was average, temperatures were cold but not extreme, and no catastrophic storms tested structures to their limits. Gustav's roof performed exactly as designed, but the testing was insufficient to convince skeptics. At the trading post in March, Henry Dalton asked how the unusual cabin had survived winter. Gustav reported no problems, no maintenance required, excellent performance. Dalton nodded, but commented that the real test would come during a hard winter. "Wait for a true storm," he said, "then we would see." Spring 1842 arrived with rapid snowmelt and rising creeks. Gustav resumed trapping with the efficiency of a man whose winter had been undisturbed by structural concerns. His pelts from the season were good quality, and the prices at the trading post reflected strong demand. He sold his furs in early May and used a portion of the profit to purchase additional supplies, including materials for minor cabin improvements. Henry Dalton commented that most trappers spent their earnings on whiskey and supplies for the next season. Gustav was investing in infrastructure. Dalton asked if he planned to stay in the territory long term. Gustav said he planned to stay alive, which required proper shelter. Summer brought the usual cycle of maintenance and preparation. Gustav improved his chimney, adding height to improve draw and prevent smoke backup during wind. He reinforced his door frame with additional brackets, not because it showed weakness, but because perfection could always be refined. He built a small cache platform near the cabin for storing supplies above ground level, protecting them from moisture and animals. The work was methodical, each task completed thoroughly before moving to the next. Other trappers in the area built or repaired their own cabins using standard methods. Marcus Webb's cabin, 5 miles north, needed new roof sections where the previous winter's snow load had caused sagging. Webb replaced the damaged poles and sod using the same construction methods that had failed. The repair took 3 days. Webb mentioned to others that he had considered adopting some of Gustav's techniques, but decided the time investment was not justified. His standard roof had lasted 3 years before requiring repair. That seemed adequate. James Pritchard built a second small cabin on his property, a storage structure for pelts and equipment. He used somewhat heavier logs than standard construction, a minor concession to Gustav's methods, but he kept the roof traditional, 4 inches of sod over birch bark over simple poles. When Gustav visited and saw the new structure, Pritchard explained his reasoning. The storage cabin held only supplies, not people. If it collapsed, the loss would be material, not mortal. For such a structure, standard construction remained appropriate. New trappers arrived in the territory during summer, men seeking fortune in furs or escape from eastern settlements. Some heard about Gustav's unusual cabin and visited to examine it. The reactions were mixed. A few asked detailed questions about construction techniques and thermal mass principles. Most simply noted the thick roof and moved on, filing it mentally as an eccentricity. One trapper from Pennsylvania commented that he had seen similar thick roof construction in German settlements used on barns and workshops. The style was uncommon, but not unknown in certain building traditions. Fall arrived with the usual preparation cycle: firewood split and stacked, supplies organized, trap lines checked and repaired. Gustav worked through September and October with the confidence of a man whose shelter required no concern. His cabin was ready for winter. It had been ready since the day construction was completed. Other trappers worked frantically through October, making last-minute repairs, reinforcing weak points, gambling that their efforts would be sufficient for whatever winter brought. In late October, experienced trappers noted unusual signs. Animal behavior was erratic. Birds migrated earlier than normal. The first snow came in mid-October, 2 weeks ahead of typical timing. James Pritchard, who had spent 12 winters in Montana Territory, mentioned to others that the signs suggested a hard winter coming. Barometric patterns felt wrong. The air had a weight to it that preceded serious storms. Other veteran trappers agreed. This winter would test structures more severely than recent years had. January 1843 arrived cold and clear. The early winter had been snowy but manageable, confirming the predictions of a hard season, but not yet delivering catastrophic conditions. Trappers settled into their routines, checking lines, processing pelts, enduring the isolation and darkness that defined mountain winters. Gustav maintained his cabin and supplies, burning firewood at his usual efficient rate, watching his roof perform as designed through a series of moderate snowfalls. On January 26th, the weather changed. Barometric pressure dropped sharply. The air became heavy and still, the kind of oppressive calm that preceded major storms. James Pritchard rode through the valley that afternoon, stopping at cabins to warn trappers. He had seen this pattern before. A significant storm was coming, probably within 24 hours. Men should prepare for 3 to 5 days of continuous snow and high winds. Those with weak structures should consider temporary relocation to more solid cabins. Gustav checked his supplies and firewood. He had enough for a week of confinement if necessary. His cabin required no structural preparation. The roof that had seemed excessive during construction now seemed appropriate. He secured his cache platform and brought additional firewood inside, stacking it near the fireplace. Then he waited. Marcus Webb appeared at Gustav's door on the evening of January 26th. He looked worried. His cabin, 5 miles north, had developed a significant leak in the roof during the last storm. He had patched it, but the repair was temporary. Webb asked if he could shelter at Gustav's cabin during the approaching storm. Gustav agreed immediately. Webb arrived with his essential supplies and bedroll 2 hours later. He commented that Gustav's cabin felt solid in a way his own did not. The thick walls and heavy roof created a sense of permanence and security. The storm arrived on January 27th at dawn. Snow began falling heavily, large wet flakes that accumulated quickly. By midday, 6 inches covered the ground. By evening, 18 inches. The temperature dropped as the storm intensified. The wet snow became drier, lighter, but fell continuously. Wind began gusting from the northwest, driving snow horizontally, creating drifts against any vertical surface. Gustav and Webb stayed inside, maintaining the fire, listening to wind howl around the cabin. Through the gunport slits Gustav had cut into the walls, they could see limited visibility outside. The world had become white, snow falling so thickly that objects more than 20 feet away disappeared. Webb commented that this was already one of the heaviest single-day snowfalls he had experienced in the territory, and the storm showed no signs of diminishing. Night fell on January 27th, with perhaps 24 inches of snow on the ground and more falling steadily. Gustav checked his roof from inside, listening for stress sounds, feeling for any settling or shifting. The structure was completely stable. The thick sod layer was absorbing the snow load, the thermal mass preventing dangerous bonding. Outside, the green ring around the cabin remained visible even through the storm, an 18-inch band where snow melted on contact with the warm ground. Webb saw it through the gunport and shook his head. Even now, the heat bleed seemed wasteful to him. January 28th brought no relief. Snow continued falling throughout the day, adding another 20 inches to the accumulation. The total depth was now over 40 inches across the region. The wind increased, gusting to speeds that made the cabin walls shudder. Gustav and Marcus Webb remained inside, conserving firewood, rationing their activity. The cabin stayed warm despite the exterior conditions. The thick walls and roof created insulation so effective that a moderate fire maintained comfortable temperature. Through the gunport slits, they could see nothing but white. The storm had become a complete whiteout, visibility reduced to a few feet. Sound carried strangely through the wind. They heard distant cracking noises several times during the day, sharp reports that cut through the constant howl of wind. Webb identified the sounds immediately. Cabins were failing. The accumulated snow weight was exceeding structural capacity. Somewhere in the valley or the surrounding hills, roofs were collapsing. Gustav calculated the load on his own roof. 40 inches of wet snow, now compacting under its own weight and beginning to freeze as temperatures dropped. The weight per square foot was substantial. A standard 4-inch sod roof would be approaching failure threshold. Many would have already collapsed. His 15-inch thick roof was barely stressed. The thermal mass effect was working exactly as designed. The bottom layer of snow on his roof was slightly above freezing, preventing the bonding that created dangerous unified weight. The snow remained somewhat loose, somewhat mobile, unable to accumulate into the crushing mass that destroyed weaker structures. The green ring around the cabin remained visible throughout the day. Every few hours, Gustav checked through the gunports. The 18-inch band of bare ground persisted, maintained by the controlled thermal bleeding that skeptics had mocked for over a year. That small heat investment was preventing tons of snow from bonding to his roof. The return on investment was their survival. Night fell on January 28th with no change in conditions. Snow continued falling, wind continued gusting. The cracking sounds of failing structures continued periodically through the darkness. Webb tried to calculate which cabins were collapsing based on the direction and distance of the sounds. He thought he heard his own cabin fail around midnight, a distant crack from the north that matched the location and distance. He mentioned it to Gustav without emotion. If his cabin was gone, there was nothing to be done about it now. They were alive, and that was sufficient. January 29th brought the storm's final phase. Another 12 inches of snow fell, bringing the total accumulation to approximately 50 inches. Then, around midday, the snow stopped. The wind continued for several more hours, driving existing snow into massive drifts, sculpting the landscape into unfamiliar shapes. By evening, the wind died. Silence fell across the valley, profound and absolute, after 3 days of constant noise. Gustav opened his door carefully, pushing against snow that had drifted against the entrance. He stepped outside into a transformed world. Snow covered everything to depths that varied from 3 feet in clear areas to 8 feet in drifts. The sky was clearing, stars becoming visible. In the east, the temperature was dropping rapidly, well below zero. The storm was over. The accounting of damage could begin. January 30th dawned clear and brutally cold. Gustav emerged from his cabin at first light to assess the regional damage. Marcus Webb followed, both men moving slowly through snow that reached their thighs in the shallower areas. The landscape had been completely transformed. Familiar landmarks were buried or hidden. The world was white, silent, and alien. Gustav's cabin stood exactly as it had before the storm. The roof showed perhaps 10 inches of loose snow, far less than the 50 inches that had fallen. The thermal mass effect had prevented accumulation throughout the 3-day event. The green ring around the perimeter was clearly visible, an 18-inch band of bare ground that circled the structure like proof of concept. The cabin had not shifted, settled, or shown any stress. It had simply absorbed everything the storm delivered and remained unchanged. They walked north toward Webb's cabin, a 5-mile journey that took 4 hours through the deep snow. They found the structure collapsed. The roof had failed completely, caving inward and taking one wall with it in the cascade of weight. The ridge poles had snapped like kindling. The sod layer had come down as a unified mass, perhaps 2,000 pounds of frozen earth and snow crushing everything beneath. Webb's supplies were buried and largely destroyed. The cabin was a total loss. Webb stood looking at the wreckage without speaking for several minutes. Then he turned to Gustav and said simply that he should have built it differently. They continued surveying the area over the next 2 days. James Pritchard's main cabin had suffered partial collapse. One corner had failed where the roof weight exceeded the wall's capacity. The structure was uninhabitable without major repairs. Pritchard had survived by recognizing the imminent failure and evacuating to his storage cabin, which had also collapsed but was unoccupied. He was alive but shelterless and shaken. 3 other cabins within a 10-mile radius had collapsed completely. 2 trappers had died. One had been crushed when his roof failed without warning during the storm's second night. The other had fled his collapsing cabin into the blizzard and frozen to death trying to reach a neighbor's shelter. A third trapper had survived by recognizing early signs of failure and spending 3 days in a root cellar he had dug for food storage. He emerged hypothermic but alive. One cabin had survived structurally but barely. The trapper had spent the entire storm bracing his sagging roof with interior poles, holding the structure up through physical effort and desperation. When Gustav and Webb reached his location, the man was exhausted, terrified, and grateful. His roof had not collapsed, but it remained on the verge. He did not trust it anymore and was preparing to abandon the structure. Of 9 cabins in the immediate area, only Gustav's remained fully intact and functional. The destruction was comprehensive and undeniable. The storm had been the test that skeptics had predicted would come. Gustav's excessive construction, his foolish investment of time and materials, his mocked thermal bleeding effect, had been proven absolutely correct under the worst conditions the Montana wilderness could deliver. The green ring that had been evidence of failure was revealed as evidence of precise engineering, but validation came with a bitter taste. 2 men were dead. February 1st brought the survivors together. Marcus Webb, homeless and humbled, remained at Gustav's cabin. James Pritchard arrived on February 2nd, requesting temporary shelter while he decided whether to rebuild or abandon the territory. Gustav provided space and supplies without hesitation. The cabin was warm, solid, and had room for 3 men to wait out the remainder of winter. Other trappers visited over the following week. Some came seeking temporary shelter. Others came to study the only structure that had survived intact. The trapper who had spent 3 days bracing his roof arrived and asked to examine Gustav's construction. He walked around the cabin slowly, studying the thick roof, the tight log fitting, the reinforced corners. He asked technical questions about ridgepole spacing, sod thickness, and thermal mass calculations. Gustav answered everything directly, sharing measurements and methods without reservation. The conversations were quiet and serious. There was no celebration of being proven right, no vindication speeches, no recriminations. Men had died. Cabins were destroyed. The survivors were processing trauma and calculating what came next. Gustav's role was not to lecture, but to help. He shared food from his supplies. He provided warmth from his fire. He explained his construction techniques to anyone who asked, treating his year of mockery as irrelevant compared to the current need for practical knowledge. Marcus Webb was particularly affected. He had been the most vocal skeptic, the man who had organized betting pools on when Gustav's roof would collapse, the source of the heat bleed mockery. He sat by Gustav's fireplace on February 4th and apologized, not for the jokes, which were within the bounds of frontier culture, but for his failure to listen when Gustav had tried to explain the engineering principles. Webb had dismissed thermal mass as theoretical nonsense. Now he understood it was practical physics. The green ring they had mocked was load management made visible. James Pritchard asked the most detailed technical questions. He wanted to understand not just what Gustav had built, but why each element mattered. The canvas moisture barrier, the clay binding layer, the thick mixed earth, the living sod with intact root systems. Gustav explained each component's function and how they worked together as a system. Pritchard took notes on birch bark, creating a crude manual for future construction. By mid-February, 8 trappers had visited Gustav's cabin to study his methods. Some planned to rebuild using modified versions of his technique. Others were leaving the territory, their losses too severe to recover from. Henry Dalton from the trading post arrived on February 16th. He had heard about the destruction and came to assess the situation. When he saw Gustav's intact cabin surrounded by tales of collapsed structures, he asked for a complete explanation of the construction method. Dalton took extensive notes. He planned to share the information with future trappers and to stock materials specifically for this type of construction. Spring 1843 brought rebuilding across the region. Marcus Webb began construction on a new cabin in early April. He adopted modified versions of Gustav's techniques, building a roof with 10 inches of thickness instead of 15, using the canvas moisture barrier system, spacing ridge poles more closely than standard construction. The compromise between Gustav's methods and traditional efficiency reflected Webb's practical nature. He could not invest 3 months in a roof, but he could invest 6 weeks. The result was substantially stronger than his previous cabin, though not as robust as Gustav's design. James Pritchard rebuilt his main cabin using a 12-inch thick roof and incorporated the layering system Gustav had demonstrated. He spent 8 weeks on construction, far longer than his original 3-day cabin, but the investment seemed justified after experiencing catastrophic failure. Pritchard also modified his corner construction, adding iron pins to reinforce the notched joints. His finished cabin was heavier, more expensive, and significantly more secure than standard frontier construction. 3 other trappers in the area rebuilt, using variations of the thick roof technique. Each adapted the method to his own circumstances, skills, and material availability. Some skipped the expensive canvas barrier, using multiple layers of birch bark instead. Some used 8 inches of sod thickness rather than 15. Some maintained traditional corner construction but reinforced the roof structure. The variations created a spectrum of designs, all influenced by Gustav's innovation, but none exactly replicating it. The technique began spreading beyond immediate survivors through word-of-mouth networks. Henry Dalton promoted it at his trading post, showing trappers his notes and explaining the thermal mass principle. Trappers passing through the region heard about the storm of 43 and the one cabin that had survived intact. Some sought out Gustav to see the structure firsthand. Others simply adopted elements they heard described secondhand, incorporating thicker roofs or better moisture barriers into their own building plans. By summer 1843, the terminology had evolved. Trappers referred to Swedish roofs or Larsen's thick roof when describing the technique. Some called it the green ring method, referencing the visible thermal effect. The names varied, but the core concept was consistent. Thicker roofs with thermal mass properties provided the superior survival characteristics compared to standard thin construction. The time and material investment was substantial, but justified by the reduced risk of catastrophic failure. New trappers arriving in Montana Territory during 1843 and 1844 heard about recommended construction methods. The thick roof technique became standard advice given to newcomers, alongside traditional wisdom about where to trap and how to avoid bear encounters. Trading posts began stocking heavier materials. Canvas sales increased. Clay and binding materials became regular inventory items. The infrastructure supporting thick roof construction developed organically as demand emerged. Gustav continued trapping through this period, his cabin serving as a physical demonstration of the technique's effectiveness. He answered questions when asked, but did not promote himself or his methods actively. The innovation spread because it worked, because survivors taught others, because practical men recognized value when they saw it demonstrated under crisis conditions. The years following the storm of 1843 saw Gustav's construction techniques spread across Montana Territory and into adjacent regions. The diffusion was organic, carried by trappers who moved between areas, by trading post operators who shared knowledge with customers, by survivors who told stories of the winter that tested every structure to failure except one. No formal documentation existed, no building codes mandated the methods. The technique spread because it solved a real problem that killed real people with predictable regularity. By 1845, an estimated 20 to 30 cabins had been built using thick roof variations across the northern Rockies. Some were faithful adaptations of Gustav's 15-inch design. Others were compromises using 8 to 10 inches of thickness. A few innovative trappers developed their own modifications, adding features Gustav had not considered or adapting the principle to different climates and elevations. The technique evolved through distributed experimentation, each builder learning from those who came before and adding their own improvements or simplifications. Trading posts adapted to support the construction method. Henry Dalton's post began stocking canvas as a standard item rather than a special order. Other posts followed. Suppliers in St. Louis and Independence added heavy moisture barrier fabric to their frontier goods inventories. The economic infrastructure supporting thick roof construction developed in response to demand. Materials that had been expensive due to rarity became more affordable as volume increased. The barrier to adoption lowered, making the technique accessible to trappers of average means rather than only those willing to invest heavily. The winter of 1847 brought another severe storm system to the region, not as catastrophic as 1843, but substantial enough to test structures. Cabins built with thick roofs survived with minimal damage. Standard thin roof cabins experienced failures similar to previous years. The pattern reinforced the technique's value. Trappers who had been skeptical about the time investment saw the practical results during crisis conditions. Word spread further. The thick roof method became increasingly standard among experienced mountain men. New terminology emerged in frontier communities. A cabin built heavy meant thick roof construction. A structure built light meant traditional methods. Men discussed construction approaches using this shorthand, understanding the trade-offs. Light construction was faster and cheaper, but riskier. Heavy construction required substantial investment but provided security. The choice became a conscious decision rather than an assumption that only one method existed. By 1850, the technique had spread into Wyoming Territory and parts of Idaho. Trappers, prospectors, and early settlers adopted variations suited to their specific needs. Some mining camps used the principle for permanent structures, creating roofs that could withstand heavy snow accumulation in high-altitude locations. Remote trading posts rebuilt using reinforced construction after losing structures to winter storms. The application expanded beyond individual trapper cabins to community infrastructure. Gustav's name remained attached to the technique among those who knew the origin story, but many users of thick roof construction never learned who had developed it. The knowledge became anonymous, absorbed into the general body of frontier building wisdom. Some trappers taught the method to others without knowing they were passing on Gustav Larsson's innovation. The technique had achieved the ultimate form of success. It was no longer an innovation, but simply the correct way to build in harsh climates. Gustav Larsson left Montana Territory in 1851. The fur trade that had drawn him west was collapsing. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction in many areas. More significantly, fashion had changed in eastern cities and European markets. Silk had replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying demand for the pelts that had sustained the mountain man economy. Trappers were leaving the wilderness, seeking new opportunities in agriculture, mining, or town businesses. Gustav recognized the inevitable and made his transition before desperation forced it. He moved to Oregon Territory and established a small carpentry business in Salem. The skills he had learned during his apprenticeship in Sweden, refined during his years building wilderness shelters, translated well to frontier town construction. He built homes, shops, and public buildings using methods that emphasized durability over speed. His reputation grew slowly among settlers who valued structures that would last decades rather than serve temporarily. He made a modest living, enough to support himself comfortably and save toward future stability. In 1852, Gustav married Anna Bergström, a Swedish immigrant who had arrived in Oregon with her family 2 years earlier. They built a home together on the outskirts of Salem, a simple structure that incorporated principles Gustav had developed in Montana. Thick walls, robust roof, attention to moisture management, and thermal efficiency. The house was unremarkable from outside, but exceptionally well built. They raised 3 children there. Gustav taught his sons carpentry, passing on techniques without explaining their origins in wilderness survival. He never wrote about his cabin innovation. No journals documented his construction methods or the storm that had validated them. When customers or acquaintances asked about his time as a trapper, he shared general stories but rarely mentioned the technical aspects of his building work. The distinction between innovation and routine work blurred in his mind. He had built a cabin that survived, that had been necessary for his survival. It did not seem remarkable enough to require documentation or promotion. Gustav died in 1879 at age 70. He was buried in Salem's Pioneer Cemetery, his gravestone identifying him simply as a carpenter and former trapper. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his Swedish heritage, his years in Montana Territory, his successful carpentry business, and his surviving family. No mention was made of the thick roof construction technique that had spread across the northern Rockies and saved dozens of lives over 3 decades. To his family and community, he was simply a skilled craftsman who had lived a quiet, productive life. His cabin in Montana stood abandoned but intact through the 1860s and into the 1870s. Travelers passing through the valley occasionally used it as shelter. Some maintained it minimally, appreciating its solid construction even without knowing its history. By the late 1870s, the cabin was weathered but structurally sound. The roof still functional, the walls still tight. It stood as physical testament to principles that had been validated by crisis and proven through decades of harsh winters. The green ring still appeared each spring around the perimeter when snow melted.